All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into an idea so powerful it can literally make or break entire religions. We're talking about a theory of a massive, radical break in history, a story of something lost and then, centuries later, supposedly restored. It's an idea that has shaped the beliefs of millions.
So, let's just cut right to the chase, shall we? The one question that's going to drive everything we talk about today is this. Did the original Christian church, the one started by Jesus and the apostles, did it completely disappear from the earth? I mean, did it just vanish for centuries, only to be brought back later? You see, this isn't just some dusty historical debate. The answer, one way or the other, has massive implications for what millions of people believe today.
Okay, so to really get a grip on this whole thing, we've got to start by breaking down the central claim. What exactly is this disappearance theory all about?
Well, this big idea has a name. It's called the Great Apostasy. And listen, the two words you absolutely have to focus on here are total and universal. We're not talking about a few churches going off the rails here and there. Nope. The claim is that the entire church, everywhere on the planet, was completely and utterly wiped out. Gone. Leaving behind this huge spiritual vacuum for hundreds and hundreds of years.
So, what does that actually look like? Well, the whole claim really rests on three main pillars. First up, a total loss of authority. The idea is that the priesthood power, the divine right to act in God's name, just poof, it was gone. Second, a corruption of the teachings. The core beliefs, they say, got all mixed up with pagan ideas, creating this kind of dark age of idolatry. And then the third and honestly most radical claim of all, the total, complete destruction of the true church. It perished from the face of the earth, leaving nothing behind for centuries.
But where did an idea this big even come from? Right? Why was a theory about a total collapse so absolutely necessary for some religious movements to even get off the ground? To figure that out, we've got to rewind and look at the history.
And this timeline, wow, it really puts the whole problem into perspective. So look over here on the left. You've got the apostolic age, right? 33 to 100 AD. Then, just look at this massive gap. We're talking nearly 1,700 years of what they call silence. Then way over on the right, you see new movements pop up, like the one Joseph Smith started. The whole Great Apostasy theory was basically created to explain away that giant gap in the middle. It was the justification for why a restoration was needed. And this quote right here, from Joseph Smith's first vision, this is really the linchpin for the whole thing. Think about it. If he's right, if all the churches that existed at the time were all wrong, and their beliefs were an abomination, well, the conclusion is pretty much inescapable, isn't it? The true church must have disappeared, which means a restoration wasn't just a nice idea, it was an absolute, non-negotiable necessity.
Okay, so what's the actual evidence for such a huge, sweeping claim? Well, people who believe in the Great Apostasy build their case mostly on a few specific passages from the Bible.
And this is where the debate really heats up. So proponents will point to a verse in 2 Thessalonians that warns of a great rebellion, or apostasia in the Greek, and they say, see, right there. They'll also bring up a prophecy from Amos about a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. But the counterargument is all about one thing: context. Critics say, hold on a minute. They argue that the rebellion in Thessalonians is tied directly to the Second Coming, not some 1,700-year gap. And that famine in Amos, that was about a judgment on ancient Israel, not the entire future church. They see these as warnings of some false teachers, a partial problem, not a total worldwide collapse.
All right, so that's the core of the case for the apostasy. Now let's flip the coin and look at the rebuttal. What are the big arguments against the idea that the church just vanished off the face of the earth? This verse from Matthew, well, for many, this is the theological trump card. It's a direct promise from Jesus Christ. And the argument is pretty simple, really. If the church was completely destroyed, even for a little while, doesn't that mean the gates of Hades actually won? This verse is seen as a divine guarantee that the church would last forever.
And right on the heels of that, you have this promise to his apostles. It just adds another layer to the whole argument. I mean, how do you square a 1,700-year absence of the church with a promise to be with your followers always until the end of the age? It's a tough circle to square.
But it's not just about theology. Opponents of the Great Apostasy theory also turn to history, and they ask a very pointed question. Look, we have tons of records of early Christians fighting tooth and nail over what seemed like pretty minor heresies. So if the entire church suddenly collapsed into what some would call Catholic heresy, with all these massive changes, where's the fight? Where are the letters, the records, the historical outcry? The silence, they argue, is just deafening. And the historical countercase keeps building. First, historians point to what looks like an unbroken line of bishops, suggesting a continuous chain of authority right from the apostles. Second, you can read the writings of the apostles' own students, and they're talking about things like the real presence and the authority of bishops, beliefs that were carried forward. And then there's this, and it's a huge one. The New Testament, the very book of Scripture we're talking about, was compiled and preserved by the exact same church that supposedly apostatized and disappeared. How does that work?
So, we've looked at the arguments for and the arguments against, but let's be real. Why does any of this matter today? Why should we care about a debate that's centuries old? Well, because the answer determines whether or not entire faiths are legitimate.
Yeah, one source we looked at calls this whole debate a foundational knockout punch. And that's a really powerful way to think about it, isn't it? It means for some faiths, their entire claim to being the true church, to having divine authority, it all stands or falls on this one single question. Did the Great Apostasy actually happen?
And really, it all just boils down to this. Look at the two columns. If the Great Apostasy is true, then yeah, the original church lost its authority, it failed, and a restoration was absolutely necessary. It also means Christ's promises, well, they failed too. But if the Great Apostasy is false, then the original church never lost its authority, a restoration wasn't needed, and Christ's promises were fulfilled. You see? There's really no middle ground here. It's a fundamental choice, and the consequences for how you view Christian history and authority are just massive.
And that brings us to our final, big-picture question to leave you with. The idea of a great apostasy isn't just theology, right? It's a claim about history. It's a specific story about failure and recovery. So it makes you wonder, if a faith is built on a particular version of history, what happens when that history gets challenged? That's a question with no simple answers, for sure. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.